There is not much known about the early life of Stephen Kay, though that is probably on purpose. But at some point, he went to law school and graduated about 1967. He had only been out of law school for about 3 years when he was put onto the Tate LaBianca trial with Vincent Bugliosi, as Bugliosi's previous partner, Aaron Stovitz, was removed for making remarks to the media about the trial. In Jeff Gein's book, Manson, he stated that it was not an equal partnership, as Stephen Kay had virtually no time to read the transcripts and get up to speed about the trial. What's very interesting is that it also says that Bugliosi told him that Helter Skelter is the theory, period. Bugliosi coached Kay on courtroom behavior, such as never referring to notes when jurors were present because that meant breaking eye contact with them. Kay thought of Bugliosi as unabashedly ambitious, but also awed by his work ethic. Various sources say that they never knew Bugliosi to sleep more than 3 or 4 hours a night while the trial was going on. Through the trial, Kay and Bugliosi would retain bodyguards. Stephen would even be followed by 2 female members of the Manson family in the courthouse parking lot. He's quoted saying, "They said they were going to do my house what was done at the Tate house." Kay and Bugliosi would win the convictions of the Manson family for the Tate LaBianca trial in 1971. The 4 convicted would receive the death penalty, though this was commuted to life in prison in 1972. Kay and Bugliosi would also win the conviction of Tex Watson. Later, in 1976, Leslie Van Houten was granted a retrial, but it was only Kay who prosecuted. This trial ended up with a hung jury, and Leslie was granted yet another trial in 1978. Van Houten was convicted this time and given life with a possibility of parole. Stephen Kay would show up to a grand majority of the parole hearings for the Manson family members in the years after. He always advocated against their releases and struck up a friendship with Deborah Tate, Sharon Tate's younger sister, who would come to these parole hearings also. Stephen Kay retired from the county prosecutor's office in 2005. He keeps a very low profile and has recalled the Manson trial as definitely the most bizarre case he had ever tried, and that it was almost a circus. Though he wished that it would just disappear, the Manson case is quoted as the case that never goes away. Not much is publicly known about Paul Fitzgerald, but it is estimated that he was born in 1937. He graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in political science and a minor in philosophy. In 1964, he earned a law degree. That same year, he moved to California with his wife and soon joined the public defender's office in Los Angeles. Fitzgerald rose rapidly and was assistant chief trial deputy when he became the lawyer for Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the Manson family women for the Tate LaBianca trial. Initially, his superiors wanted him to drop the case due to a conflict of interest. The office had previously represented others involved with Manson, but Fitzgerald refused. Initially, Paul stated that Bugliosi's case against Manson was weak. Paul was remembered as having felt that Krenwinkel was a victim of brainwashing by Charles Manson, and that he had a tremendous responsibility in defending her. Krenwinkel was not just a non-paying client, but his only client. The trial caused financial hardship for him, especially since he had 2 children at the time. Stephen Kay remembered Paul as having argued his heart out before the jury, but there was just too much evidence against her. Many felt that he did the best he could, but it was ultimately an unwinnable case. When looking back at the Manson family law team, when it was Fitzgerald, Irving Kanarek, Dacian, and Ronald Hughes, Paul Fitzgerald was recalled as the most talented lawyer on the team. Paul ended up as the lead lawyer, trying to keep a chaotic situation under control. During the penalty phase of the trial, Krenwinkel joined the other girls in talking about the murders in horrifying detail. Paul looked shell-shocked, though he had been warned of the plan in advance. Krenwinkel and the others would be convicted and given the death penalty. This was commuted to life in 1972. During parole hearings, Fitzgerald would represent Patricia and Leslie Van Houten. He thought of Patricia's story as tragic, of a normal middle-class girl who had been brainwashed. Fitzgerald would remain in private practice representing unsympathetic characters. He would go on to be sought out as a lecturer discussing the topic of the hopeless case. Paul Fitzgerald passed away in October of 2001. The exact day I could not find. He was 64 years old. He is buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Westwood, California. Maxwell Keith was born on July 16, 1924, in Pasadena, California. He served in the Army Air Forces during World War II and graduated from Princeton University in 1946 with a degree in economics. He attended Loyola Law School and passed the bar in 1953. Maxwell worked as a deputy district attorney for several years before entering private practice with attorney Grant B. Cooper. In 1960, Keith took over for Cooper as chief counsel for Dr. R. Bernard Finch, a Los Angeles area physician that was accused of killing his wife. Keith is quoted about that case saying that this was the trial of the century. Of its day. Finch ended up being convicted, but Maxwell Keith was able to make a name for himself, and sources state that this was how he ended up being appointed to the Manson case. Maxwell Keith was placed as Leslie Van Houten's lawyer after her other lawyer, Ronald Hughes, went missing during the late months of 1970. Appointed in December of 1970, Keith had over 18,000 pages of court documents to read and was placed right before the closing arguments. When Ronald Hughes went missing, there was a motion for mistrial, which Judge Older denied. Leslie Van Houten denied Maxwell Keith at first, wanting to fire him almost immediately. Maxwell Keith would be the first and only one of the defense attorneys to pinpoint Charles Manson as the mastermind for the murders. It was clear from the start that he was representing his client and not Manson, Vincent Bugliosi recalled. In 1971, Van Houten and the others would be convicted and given the death penalty. This was commuted to life in 1972. In 1971, Keith would also represent Tex Watson at his trial. Watson ended up being convicted of the murders that he committed. Watson remembered Keith in his book as a chain smoker and looking exactly how a lawyer should look in his mind. Interestingly enough, he doesn't mention Keith really after that. Leslie Van Houten would be granted a retrial later in the 70s, with the first trial resulting in a hung jury. She had another trial in 1978, which tried to use the contention of diminished capacity. The idea was that Leslie was so high on drugs or messed up from substances that she couldn't and shouldn't be held accountable, or as accountable, for the crime she committed. Maxwell represented her for these trials also, though she still ended up being convicted. In 1995, Maxwell Keith retired. In March of 2012, the exact date is not exactly known. One source said March 5th, but then they also got the year wrong of when he died. But in March of 2012, Maxwell Keith passed away in Templeton, California, after convalescing from pneumonia. He was 87 years old. Irving Kanarek was born on May 12, 1920, in Seattle, Washington. He was one of two children born to Meyer and Beatrice Kanarek. His parents were of Russian and Polish descent. Irving received a B.A. in chemistry from the University of Washington. He worked at North American Aviation, where he invented a corrosion inhibitor for inhibited red fuming nitric acid rocket fuel for the Army's Project Nike, which was America's first operational and anti-aircraft missile system. At some point while working in this industry, he was falsely accused of being a communist and lost his security clearance. Kanarek sued, and his security clearance was restored, along with back pay. Intrigued by the law after this, he attended Loyola University and was admitted to the California bar in 1957. One of his early clients was Jimmy Lee Smith, who had kidnapped a pair of police officers with Gregory Powell and killed one of the officers in an onion field. Powell was convicted and sentenced to death later. One way or another, Charles Manson heard about Kanarek, and Irving became his lawyer for the Tate LaBianca trial. In Jeff Gein's book, he stated that Kanarek bragged about Charlie coming to him, though Kanarek's own daughter, Irvina, stated that this wasn't verifiable, nor did it reflect her father's personality. Vincent Bugliosi wrote, Canarac was something of a legend in the Los Angeles courts. The attorney's obstructionist tactics had caused a number of judges to openly censure him from the bench. In the case of People versus Goodman, Canarac had stretched a simple theft case, which should have taken a few hours or a day at most, to 3 months. Canarac was recalled as a force of nature, sometimes to the extreme. He was loud, argumentative, and objected repeatedly to questions, answers, and even the prosecution's opening statement. When he took the Manson case, the LA County District Attorney's Office worried that the trial would become a circus. Manson ended up being convicted and sentenced to life. Years later, Canarac stated that Manson had nothing to do with the murders. He recalled Manson as a personable guy. Irving would stay in contact with Manson in the years after. In 1989, Canarac spent time in a rest home, and when he came back, he owed $40,000 in debt. He battled colon cancer, then overcame it. On September 2nd, 2020, Irving Canarac passed away at the age of 100. With the exception of Stephen Kay, he outlived almost every other attorney at the trial. He was buried at Home of Peace Memorial Park and Mortuary. And I would like to thank Irvina Canarac, Irving's daughter, for supplying correct information about this subject. Thank you. Day Shin was born on September 2nd, 1916. Not much seems to be known about his early life, though according to Find a Grave, he served in the U.S. Navy as an SF-2 during World War II. Day married and divorced somewhere around 5 times, and at some point went to law school. Helter Skelter and Susan Atkins' books both state that Day was of Korean descent. Before the Manson case, Shin had been obtaining Mexican domestics for Southern California families. Day Shin had been brought onto the Manson case on what in Helter Skelter says March 11th, 1970, when Susan Atkins asked for her previous lawyer, Richard Caballero, be replaced with Shin. According to Helter Skelter, there was initially a potential conflict of interest with Shin, as he had represented Charles Manson on several matters and had visited him more than 40 times. Shin denied any conflict, and Judge Keene then warned Atkins of the possible dangers of being represented by an attorney who had been so closely involved with one of her co-defendants. Atkins didn't care. She wanted Shin, and the substitution was granted. On leaving the courtroom, Shin told awaiting reporters that Susan Atkins definitely will deny everything she told the grand jury. At one point during the trial, Shin was held in contempt of court and spent 3 nights in the county jail. He was later quoted saying, "I am now having marital problems, Your Honor. My wife thinks I'm spending the night with some other woman. She doesn't read English. Now my dog won't even talk to me." Shin is credited as the person who slipped Manson a newspaper about President Nixon saying Manson was guilty. At some point, Day Shin asked Linda Kasabian if she believed in Santa Claus. In Helter Skelter, Bugliosi wrote, "It was no secret that several, if not all, of the defense attorneys were frightened of the family. Day Shin, I was told by one of his fellows, kept a loaded gun in each room of his house in case of an unannounced visitation." Shin called no witnesses on behalf of Susan Atkins. Her father refused to have anything to do with her. Despite being her lawyer for the majority of the trial, Susan Atkins only mentions Day Shin once in her book. After reading through multiple books, it's clear that Shin was among those who tried for a mistrial, though that, of course, did not happen. Day Shin died on June 14th, 2006. He's buried at National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. He was 89 years old. Dean Allen Morehouse was born on February 13th, 1920, in Minnesota. Not very much is known about his early life offhand from books about the Manson family, but at some point he married and had a daughter named Ruth Ann. Dean was a minister, and one day in 1967 picked up a hitchhiker named Charles Manson. The two had what was considered a good conversation, and Morehouse brought Manson back to his house and introduced Manson to his wife and daughter. Manson seemed to instantly set his eyes on Dean's daughter, Ruth Ann, who was about 15 years old at the time. Manson ended up sleeping with Ruth Ann, where her mother got the cops involved, and Dean vowed to kill Charlie. Manson gave Dean some LSD and calmed him down, and managed to stay at their house for a few weeks. In August of 1967, Dean and Ruth Ann's mother divorced after she became uncomfortable with his friendship with Charles Manson. Dean would meet up with Manson again at Dennis Wilson's house, where Manson would kiss Dean's feet and give him LSD. For some reason, Diane Lake's book states that Dean bent down to kiss Charlie's feet, which surely that probably happened. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. He would go on, though, to befriend Tex Watson and hang around Dennis Wilson's place. Dean would do yard work, but also try to seduce the women around the house, which caused problems because he was a lot older. Dean would also proselytize to anyone about his philosophy. In Tex Watson's book, he stated that Morehouse would give spiritual counsel to Terry Melcher. His book also stated that him and Dean went up to Ukiah, California, and Terry Melcher's Jaguar XKE with one of Melcher's credit cards, because Morehouse had an LSD charge he had to go to trial for. Tex wrote, "We picked up the car one morning at Terry's house in Benedict Canyon, a rambling ranch-style place at 10,050 Cielo Drive. It was the first time I'd been to the house, but it would not be the last." Charlie would basically ditch Morehouse because he didn't want a horny old man like Dean going after his young loves. Young loves is essentially code for the minors that would be in the family. Dean Morehouse worshipped Manson. One day, Charlie was sitting in Dennis Wilson's living room tuning his guitar, when Dean crawled up to Charlie on his hands and knees like a puppy and just looked up at him. Charlie asked, "Are you ready to die this instant?" And Dean Morehouse said, "Yes, I am." Where Charlie replied, "You can live forever, brother." Dean Morehouse died on May 22, 2010. He's buried at Shasta Union Cemetery in Shasta, California. Danny DiCarlo was born on June 20th, 1944, in Toronto, Canada. He served in the U.S. Coast Guard as a weapons expert and was granted citizenship afterwards. After serving, he went into the firearms business with his father. Many recall that Danny had a love of guns so much that he loved them more than his old lady. In 1966, he was arrested for smuggling marijuana across the U.S.-Mexico border. Somewhere around this time, he became a member of the Straight Satans, a motorcycle gang, and DiCarlo would become club treasurer for them. Somewhere in the mix, Danny married and had a son. Because of his affiliation with the Straight Satans, DiCarlo would meet Charlie Manson in March of 1969, not long after separating from his wife. The gang would protect Manson's group over at Spawn Ranch. Danny would be the only member to fully join Manson's group. Various sources state that he had the nickname Donkey Dan because of his appendage. Danny was tasked with taking care of all of the family's weapons. He would clean and repair them, even sleeping in the gun room. When a weapon was taken out, he would know. DiCarlo was fond of the women at the ranch. One in particular was Ruth Ann Morehouse. Eventually, he did grow tired of most of the girls and their nonstop preaching of Charlie's ideas. Danny was among those arrested at the Spawn Ranch raid of August of 1969. After that, he had heard about Gary Hinman's murder and left the family to move to Venice. He split after all the murder talk, afraid that he'd be next. In November of 1969, DiCarlo was interviewed by police and provided incriminating information on the family. He also gave them a tour of Spawn Ranch while handcuffed. When talking to police around this time, they told him about the death of family member Zero, John Philip Hott. DiCarlo stated that the death didn't sound like suicide, but instead a murder. DiCarlo would go on to testify against the family in their trials. Ted LaBianca, Tex Watson, and Bobby Beausoleil's trials. Even though there was a $25,000 reward that he could have collected a portion of, he never did. DiCarlo ended up skipping bail on a federal gun charge and went back to Canada. Nancy Pittman was born on January 1st, 1951, in Springfield, Illinois. Her father was employed in the aerospace industry, similar to other girls in the Manson family, actually. She grew up in Malibu, California, with some brothers. She met Charles Manson through Angela Lansbury's daughter, Deirdre. Deirdre hung out with the family from time to time. Nancy had problems with her family and was accepted into their group. One of her nicknames was Brenda McCann, one of the false IDs made for her, and as was with other family members. Nancy is recalled as having been talented with needlework in Squeaky Frommy's book Reflection. To quote, "Brenda was the witch-handed girl who had brought us to the art of colored threads. She had pulled a wad of muslin from her pocket and, without breaking conversation, drew out an arm's length of thick embroidery thread. Separating the filaments by half, she dabbed and emmed on her tongue, threaded the needle, and continued an abstract doodle on the material, her face lifting to our curiosity. Nancy was there to help deliver Charlie and Mary Bruner's son, Michael. Born breech, she held the baby upside down, patting him on the back. This was at the abandoned house in Topanga Canyon. While they stayed at this house, police would come by often, and Nancy would have to hide because she was still a teenager. When the family lived at Dennis Wilson's, she garnered the attention of him. He told Charlie one day, "I'm falling in love with Brenda," to which Manson laughed and said, "Who wouldn't fall in love with Brenda?" Nancy was also there when Susan Atkins gave birth to her son, Zizose Zadfrak. She caught the baby and cleared his nose for his first breath. Helter Skelter recalls Nancy as one of the family's most hardcore members. Vincent Bugliosi wrote that he thought Ronald Hughes' disappearance and Nancy Pittman surrendering herself to police in late 1970 were related. Nancy had been missing for several weeks after a forgery charge. Nancy was among those arrested at the Spawn Ranch raid and the Barker Ranch raid in October of that same year. During the Tate LaBianca trials, she was among those that shaved her head, hung around outside the courthouse, and carved an X into her forehead. In 1972, Pittman pled guilty to being an accessory in the 1972 murder of Lauren Willett. Willett was murdered with her husband, James. Leslie Louise Van Houten was born on August 23, 1949, in Altadena, California. She grew up in a middle-class family with having an older brother and then 2 younger adopted siblings. Her parents divorced when she was 13 or 14, as she started smoking marijuana and taking LSD around age 15. At age 16, she became pregnant, and her mother forced her to have an abortion. Leslie was then ordered to bury the fetus in their backyard, a source stating that she resented her mother after this traumatic event. In 1967, she graduated from high school, then lived with her father while attending business college, training to be a legal secretary. A source states that Leslie planned to be useful to a yogic community after finishing school. In the summer of 1968, Leslie met Catherine Scher and Bobby Beausoleil, moving in with them and Bobby's wife. Jealous arguments broke up the four, and Catherine Scher went to live on Charles Manson's commune. Scher told Leslie about Charlie, and Leslie went with her. At first, Charlie told them to go back to Bobby because he was a good friend, but Catherine pleaded and he let them stay. Leslie proved useful to Manson, with one source stating that her secretarial skills, such as writing shorthand, allowed her to write down his lyrics. On the night of August 9, 1969, Leslie Van Houten went with Patricia Krenwinkel and Tex Watson into the house of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. The 3 killed the couple, Patricia and Leslie focusing on Rosemary. There have been various debates about whether Leslie actually killed Rosemary. Some state that she stabbed Rosemary after she was already dead, while others think that Rosemary may have still been alive or technically alive. After the murders, the trio ate food out of the LaBianca fridge, took some of their belongings, including wearing clothes that the couple owned, and returned back to Spawn Ranch. Leslie was convicted of the murder and initially sentenced to death, but this was commuted to life in 1972. She then had a retrial in 1977 after it was declared that there should have been a mistrial when her initial lawyer went missing during the 1970 trial. This resulted in a hung jury. Her second retrial was in 1978, which resulted again in her conviction, though with the possibility of parole. Leslie had over 22 parole hearings, being granted and then denied parole multiple times. On July 11, 2023, Leslie was released on parole after serving 52 years in prison. On August 7th, 2025, she was formally discharged from parole, marking the end of her sentence. Catherine Kitty Lutzinger was born on August 14, 1952. Not much is known about her early life, but at some point she met Bobby Beausoleil and became one of his girlfriends. She became a part of the Manson family through Bobby and was pregnant by him at that time. Apparently, Manson often threatened her as he felt that she was trying to lure Bobby away from the family. And tired of these threats, she left Spawn Ranch on July 30th, 1969, going to the police to report her concerns about Manson, and then returned to her parents' home. While away, Bobby was arrested for the murder of Gary Hinman. She would call the ranch asking about what happened to Bobby, but no one would tell her. Eventually, Manson would say that he had been arrested, but wouldn't divulge what for. He told Kitty it wasn't a big deal, and that Bobby would be released soon. On August 15th, 1969, Kitty called Spawn Ranch, asking for someone to pick her up because she was having trouble with her parents. They took her to the ranch, and the next day, it was raided. Kitty was among those arrested. Kitty would go with the family to the desert, and at Myers Ranch, she was finally told what Bobby was in jail for. Susan Atkins told her that Bobby was in for murder, and laughed. On October 9th, 1969, Kitty and Stephanie Schramm fled Barker Ranch and flagged down a passing car, asking for protection. She voiced her concerns about Manson and implicated Susan Atkins in the Hinman murder. In Susan's book, she stated that police found Steve Grogan and another member named Randy sleeping on the ground with sawed-off shotguns next to them. To quote the book, it said, though the officers were unaware of it, the pair had been stalking human game, Stephanie and Kitty, the two 17-year-olds who had fled the previous day. By this time, Kitty was 5 months pregnant. The girls asked the police for protection and were taken to Independence, California, to be interviewed by detectives. When it was learned that Kitty was Bobby's girlfriend, she was asked what she knew about the Hinman murder. She said she had heard that Manson had sent Bobby and a girl named Susan Atkins to Hinman's house to collect some money, and that when he refused to pay, they killed him. On February 11th, 1970, Kitty gave birth to a daughter named Jean. During the Te La Bianca trial, Kitty was among those who would hang outside the courthouse, having carved an X into her forehead. Kitty was arrested in November of 1971 for aiding and abetting the escape of family member associate Kenneth Como, who became one of Catherine Scher's husbands. But the charges were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Kitty married in 1973 and eventually faded out of public consciousness. John Philip Hott was born on April 20th, 1947 in West Virginia. Relatively little is known about his early life, though he did serve in the U.S. Navy during Vietnam. He moved from Ohio to California with his friend, Kenneth Richard Brown. Not much is really written about Zero through all of the books about the Manson family. Jeff Gein's book states that Manson thought of Zero as a weakling. His nicknames with the family were Christopher Jesus and Zero. Zero was among the people arrested in the Barker Ranch raid of October of 1969. He was never brought to trial or found guilty of any crime. Once out of jail, Zero moved with other family members to a house on Venice Beach. On November 5th, 1969, Zero mysteriously died while playing Russian roulette. His death was considered a suicide, though many people have always believed he was murdered by the Manson family. When police arrived at the scene, Catherine Gillies, Bruce Davis, Susan Bartell, and Madeline Joan Cottage were present. Madeline, also known as Little Patty, stated that she had been lying on the right side of the mattress, Zero on the left, when he noticed a leather case in a stand next to the bed and remarked, "Oh, here's a gun." Or perhaps maybe, "Oh, here's a gun." He removed the .22 caliber Ivor and Johnson revolver from the case, and Little Patty said, "There's only one bullet in it." Zero held the gun in his right hand, spun the cylinder, placed the muzzle against his right temple, and placed the trigger. Interestingly, the revolver in its holster had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and the gun was fully loaded. Jeff Gein's book states that instead of having 1 live round and 7 chambers, the gun had 7 live rounds and 1 spent shell. Later, an anonymous man told a Los Angeles Times writer that he was present when Zero died. The man stated that Zero didn't kill himself, but one of the girls shot him. However, the man disappeared before authorities could talk to him. Later, Danny DiCarlo was questioned by police for something totally different when they told him about Zero's death. DiCarlo stated that it didn't sound like suicide, but instead murder. When Leslie Van Houten heard of his death, she reportedly cracked a little. In Helter Skelter, it states that Zero's body was still warm to the touch when police found him. John Philpott is buried at Two Bridges Cemetery in Wintersville, Ohio. Greg Jacobson was born on August 2, 1939, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Relatively little seems to be known about his early life, though some sources state that he was adopted. 2 famous people in the music industry. Greg was a talent scout and had been married at one point to the daughter of comedian Lou Costello. Through his friendship with Dennis Wilson, Greg met Charles Manson. From there, Greg would introduce Manson to Melcher. Manson would talk to Greg and introduced him to Ruth Ann Morehouse. In Jeff Gein's book, Ruth Ann was well liked by Greg, on top of Danny DiCarlo and Terry Melcher, to name a few. When he wasn't with Ruth Ann, Charlie would talk to Greg about the music business and his various beliefs. While Greg would listen to Charlie and his music, he felt that Manson was more interesting to look at than listen to. Every time Greg would come by Dennis Wilson's house, Charlie and the girls would be there, lounging in the pool, sometimes even running around naked. I also want to point out that Ruth Ann was still a minor. Greg, Dennis, and Terry Melcher were part of a group called the Golden Penetrators. Greg and Dennis seemed more enthused with Manson than Terry ever was. While Terry Melcher had hired Greg to scout out new musical talent, the connection Charlie had didn't make it any easier in getting a record deal from Melcher. Even though Melcher trusted Greg Jacobson, he didn't sign people based on his friends' say-so alone. One source also states that Greg told Rudy Altobelli about Manson. Altobelli was the owner of 10,050 Cielo Drive. Court transcripts show that Greg had over 100 conversations with Manson about his philosophy on life. Manson told Greg that there was no such thing as right or wrong. Charlie and Greg would debate many times about these concepts, such as whether death was subjective or not. That death was only a physical change at the end of the body, a physical change that took place at the end of the lifespan of the body, and the spirit went on from there, and that is what was important. The essence of life went on. The body did not have much to do with the essence of life. He also quoted Manson as saying that death is a concept of man that exists only in the head, in the intellect. Catherine Gillies was born on August 2nd, 1950 or 1949, in Santa Cruz, California. Before joining the Manson family, she was a groupie for Buffalo Springfield. It was through Catherine that the Manson family would gain access to Barker and Myers ranches, property owned by Catherine's grandmother in Death Valley. Arlene Barker, her grandmother, had stated that Manson had visited her, asking for permission to camp at her ranch. She initially thought there would only be a few people and allowed for it, thinking it would be for a few days. Manson presented her with a gold record which had been presented to the Beach Boys, commemorating $1 million in sales. Manson told her that he was the composer or arranger for the group. Before the October 1969 Barker Ranch raid, Manson contacted Arlene Barker about 2 or 3 weeks before. He wanted to buy the ranch, but Arlene told him that she wanted cash. He said he'd talk to her again once he had it. Helter Skelter by Bugliosi states that Manson thought that if he owned the property, he'd have less problems with law enforcement. Manson had concocted a plan to try killing Catherine's grandmother in order to gain Myers Ranch. This plan was foiled, though, when the killers got a flat tire. Catherine was among the more devout of Charlie's followers, claiming that Manson had nothing to do with the Tate LaBianca murders, and that they were all just copycat killings to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail. Catherine was among those seen outside the courthouse when the trials were going on, having shaved her head and carving an X onto her skin like the other cult members. She would go on to testify that she wanted to go with the others on the night of the LaBianca murders. Helter Skelter quotes her saying, "I followed Katie to the car and asked if I could go with her. Linda, Leslie, and Sadie were all in the car. And they said that they had plenty of people to do what they were going to do, and that I didn't need to go." Even decades after the murders, Jillies could be quoted stating that she thought what the family did was right. In court, she had said, "You know, I'm willing to kill for a brother. We all are. To get a brother out of jail, I would kill. I would have killed that night." But the family didn't need her. Catherine Jillies died on June 29, 2018 in Cave Junction, Oregon. She was 68 years old. Brooks Ramsey Poston was born on December 15, 1948, in Borger, Texas. He dropped out of high school at the age of 18 and made his way to California. It says that, in one source, he made his way to Los Angeles and came across Dean Morehouse, though it's possible that he might have came across Dean Morehouse in Ukiah, California. I'm not sure which one it really is. Either way, Dean Morehouse was a former minister that got turned on to LSD thanks to Charles Manson, and would tout various philosophies because of him. In Paul Watkins' book, it states that they had met in Ukiah. Morehouse raved about Manson and took Brooks to meet him at Dennis Wilson's house. When they arrived, Charlie kissed Morehouse's feet. In Paul Watkins' book, Brooks recalled that interaction. Charlie asked him, "Are you ready to die this instant?" And Dean said, "Yes, I am." Where Charlie replied, "You can live forever, brother." In Watkins' book, he's quoted, "Yeah, Dean was pretty far out. He's the one who first turned me on to LSD and told me about Charlie. Said Charlie was the most tuned-in dude he'd met. Old Dean was right on. I couldn't believe it either, man, 'cause Charlie had made it with Dean's virgin daughter, Ruth Ann, down on the beach in Mendocino. Dean was pissed plenty at first, said he'd kill Charlie. But shit, after Charlie turned his love on Dean, Dean just said, 'Far out.'" Brooks took Charlie's teachings to heart and became catatonic at times. When Charlie would talk of ego death, apparently Poston would feel like he would literally die. Tex Watson also wrote of Brooks in his book, saying, "Brooks Poston, who was later sent to the desert with Paul and came under Crockett's influence as well, began as a stable hand at the ranch, shoveling manure. He was always weak and unreliable as far as Charlie was concerned, because on his first acid trip, he laid on a mattress for 3 days in his own excrement, completely out of his mind." In Paul Watkins' book, he and Poston would shovel manure a lot. No member of the family had more discontent duty than Brooks. No one shoveled more shit. Tons of it, he used to say. Fucking tons of it. The two would strike up a friendship over their shared interest in music. They would eventually defect from Charlie and the family while out in the desert. They began to follow an old desert rat named Paul Crockett, and Crockett was the major influence to help Poston see through the manipulation of Charlie's teachings. Poston would later go on to testify at the Tate LaBianca trial. Barbara Hoyt was born on December 27, 1951. Not much seems to be known about her early life, but in April of 1969, she joined the Manson family after running away from home. Paul Watkins wrote about her in his book, describing her as a buxom, gregarious brunette runaway. She was assigned to a guy named Karate Dave by Manson, and she fell into the tempo of things on Gresham Street. Watkins wrote that Barbara was a latecomer to the family that came when Helter Skelter was in its incipient stages. Barbara became one of the babysitting mainstays for the family. On the night of the Tate murders in August of 1969, Susan Atkins told Barbara to retrieve 3 sets of dark clothes, and when she returned, Charlie had apparently smiled at her and told her that the others had already left. Barbara was among those arrested at the Spahn Ranch raid of August of 1969. When Shorty Shea was murdered by the family at the end of August, she allegedly heard his screams as he was being killed. Jeff Gein's book states that she was sleeping in a trailer on high ground past the movie set when she heard the screams. One day, Paul Watkins had went down the wash when they were out in the desert, when Barbara and a girl named Sherry appeared from behind a rock. They wanted to hike out of the valley and go back to L.A. Barbara stated, "We're afraid of Charlie." They expressed their concerns to Paul Crockett, the person that Watkins and Brooks Poston had defected to, and they went with him to their cabin and talked over coffee. She's quoted as saying, "Charlie says we're free, that there are no rules, but we're not free. He says we can do what we want, but we can't. He said about 2 weeks ago that if we tried to leave, he'd poke out our eyes with sticks." They were given supplies, then walked 16 hours before finally reaching the general store in Ballarat. Barbara will become one of the witnesses for the prosecution during the Tate LaBianca trials. At first, she was unsure about doing so. The family took her to Hawaii, where Ruth Ann Morehouse gave Barbara a burger laced with 10 tabs of acid. Barbara freaked out, ran 10 blocks, then collapsed. She was taken to the emergency room, and after that, she decided to testify. Barbara Hoyt passed away on December 3rd, 2017 from kidney failure. She was 65 years old. Diane Lake's grand jury testimony, or rather lack of it, is an interesting snippet at the legal proceedings surrounding the Manson family. Initially brought into the courtroom as Diana Bluestein, Diane ended up admitting her real name and birth date. Before appearing in court, she had used the fake name Bluestein and lied about her age, saying that she was in her 20s. Because of this, she was jailed at Sybil Brand after the Barker Ranch raid and treated just like everyone else. In her book, Diane stated that she didn't know what came over her, but she felt compelled to tell her real name and age. Looking back, it could have been the foresight that whatever the family had going on was going to end. They will see that this is coming down. Then it will be too late, she wrote. Even still, she did end up lying on the stand when questioned. She claimed that she wasn't living at Spahn Ranch on August 16, 1969, and that she wasn't arrested by the sheriff's department that day, claiming she was somewhere else. She claimed that she didn't hear about the Tate murders at all, instead only hearing about it for the first time at the police station in Inyo County. When asked how she got to Inyo County, she stated that she went there by herself, in a truck, but someone else drove. She claimed that she didn't know the driver. Bugliosi asked if she ever saw a glass jug with Helter Skelter written on it, and she claimed no. He asked if she saw any magazines in a drawer at Barker Ranch, to which she said yes, but didn't divulge who bought them. Some were movie magazines, but Diane said she didn't know who read them. In her book, Diane admitted to lying on the stand because she was still afraid of Charlie and any possible retaliation from the other girls, understandably so, as Diane would have been sent back to the jail with all the other Manson women, whether she lied on the stand or not. To quote, "I answered them as evasively as I could. I said on the stand that I never knew anything about anything. I was going to cover every possible tie-in I could. They must have figured they were not going to get anything useful from me, so they dismissed me from any further testimony." Even still, the court was still able to indict Charles Manson and the others. In the Tate LaBianca trial, the prosecution's final witness was intended to be Diane Lake. She ended up being the third to last, with 2 psychiatrists to be questioned on the stand after. What's most interesting about Diane Lake's testimony is that there does not seem to be any surviving transcripts of her time in court. Cielo Drive, the website, is one of the best websites out there to read about the Manson case, with many of the court transcripts available for free to read. There are multiple instances of certain parts of the trial that are missing through the transcripts, and this is also reflected there. The missing transcripts are also noted in Mike Stewart's digital versions of the court transcripts, which are actually available on Amazon pretty cheaply as of 2025 as I record this. There are few books that actually really speak on this part of the trial, with many seeming to skip through the legal happenings of the Manson family as a whole. Diane Lake went on stand in November of 1970, but very little is talked about her time there. Susan Atkins doesn't mention Diane Lake at all in her book Child of Satan, Child of God. Tex doesn't, understandably, mention Diane going to court, and Jeff Geen only wrote that she was among the final witnesses for the prosecution. In her own book, Diane wrote that a special hearing was done before the lawyers and defendants only, no jury, so that mostly the defense would know what she was going to say. She noted years later that it was clear the defense would try to make it seem like she was an accomplice with knowledge ahead of time of the criminal acts, as a way to eliminate her testimony. Diane's testimony was the only real way to convict Leslie Van Houten for the murder of Rosemary LaBianca, as Diane had seen Leslie burning items taken from the LaBianca household. Diane's testimony was also used to help implicate Patricia Krenwinkel, as both Leslie and Pat had recalled stories about their crimes to Diane. The defense tried to make Diane appear as uncreditable because she lied a year before to the grand jury about knowing anything about the murders. Ultimately, this didn't work because the prosecutors at the grand jury were Vincent Bugliosi and Aaron Stovitz, of which Bugliosi was still the main prosecutor at the Tate LaBianca trial, and who Diane was a witness for. Even further, in the court transcripts, it points this out too, that Diane was a minor at the time, and any potential perjury charges would have only been seen in juvenile court. Even still, Diane's testimony itself is missing from the court transcripts. Diane's testimony ultimately helped convict Leslie Van Houten, who was originally sentenced to death in 1971. Doris Tate was born Doris Gwendolyn Willett on January 16, 1924, in Houston, Texas. Her parents were Doris Wells Willett and Fanny Della Luce. Relatively little is known about her early life, but at some point she met Paul Tate, and the couple married in 1942. On January 24, 1943, the couple had their first child together, Sharon Marie Tate. On November 6, 1952, they had their second daughter, Deborah Tate, and on October 30th, 1957, they had their third daughter, Patricia Gay Tate. The couple raised their children experiencing various parts of the world, as Paul Tate was an intelligence officer for the U.S. Army. At one point, the family was stationed in Italy, where their oldest daughter, Sharon, graduated high school. On August 9, 1969, Sharon was brutally murdered by the Manson family, despite begging for her life and being 8 months pregnant. Sharon had planned to name her son Paul Richard. In an interview from 1982, Doris stated that she was in shock for 3 years after her daughter and grandson's murders. Because of the murders, Doris went on to advocate for victims' rights, campaigning to change laws that allowed families of murder victims a greater voice. In the 1982 interview, she stated that people told her how Tex Watson was a born-again Christian and should be released to do the Lord's work. Doris stated that there was no better place for him to do that than in prison. In a video with 60 Minutes, Doris is quoted as having said about Susan Atkins, "The first time that I saw her, Atkins, I could have taken her by the neck and just broke every bone in her body, just thrown her down. You know, they have proven they cannot live in a society with other people." Included were clips of a parole hearing with Atkins where Doris pointed out that Atkins's tears were fake. Doris pointed out that Susan never said that she was sorry. And Susan's rebuttal was that sorry was an overused and inadequate word, nearly reminiscent of something Leslie Van Houten said during the trials, such as, "Sorry is just a 5-letter word." A final quote from Doris is, "Being the mother of this child, Sharon, I'm going to do whatever is necessary to see that justice is done. To have them released and put out on the streets, there was no justice to that at all." And that was in reference to the Manson family members being eligible for parole. Doris Tate passed away on July 10th, 1992 from brain cancer. She was 68 years old. Doris is buried with Sharon and her son Paul at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. On August 8, 1969, members of the Manson family made their way to 10,050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, California, and proceeded to murder everyone there, with the exception of one person, being William Garretson. The most famously of those murdered was pregnant actress Sharon Tate, who was close to her due date. By most, if not all accounts, Sharon was the last to die. Before she was killed, Susan Atkins said something that she would later try to erase. In her grand jury testimony on December 5, 1969, Susan stated that she had grabbed Sharon by the hand and put her arm around her neck. Sharon looked at Susan and begged her to let her sit down, and Susan did. Susan claimed, in her grand jury testimony, mind you, that she stated that, "I went over and put her down on the couch and looked into her face, knowing that anything that I would say, I was saying to myself, in a sense, reassuring myself. I looked at her and said, 'Woman, I have no mercy for you.' And I knew at that time I was talking to myself and not to her." At the Tate LaBianca trial in 1970, Susan's former cellmates, Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, both testified that Susan told them that she told Sharon Tate, "I have no feelings for you, bitch. You're going to die," despite Sharon's pleas to let her live. In a 1976 interview, Susan stated that she felt absolutely nothing for Sharon, even though she begged for her life and the life of her baby.
And I was left to sit and watch Sharon Tate. And about that time, all I can remember seeing is people just scattering in different places and running in different places. And I was left sitting with Sharon Tate, and she was talking to me. And I remember that I had absolutely, I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of her baby. And, Jesus.
In her book, Child of Satan, Child of God, Susan simply stated that she told Sharon Tate, "Shut up, bitch. You're going to die." The book also claims that she couldn't kill Sharon, despite Howard and Graham's testimonies, that Susan told them that she stabbed Sharon in the chest. In Susan's 1979 parole hearing, Stephen Kay held Susan accountable for what she said, pointing out that she told Virginia Graham, "Sharon was the last to die." Stephen Kay then recalled that at this point, Susan Atkins laughed. In 1979, the transcript expands on the quote more, with Stephen Kay reading out loud that Susan Atkins told Sharon Tate, "Look, bitch, I don't care about you. I don't care if you're going to have a baby. You had better be ready. You are going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." Atkins later told Ronnie Howard that she kept stabbing Sharon until she stopped screaming. Susan would go on to deny ever stabbing Sharon Tate, stating in her 1996 parole hearing that she was exaggerating and lying. Once again, Stephen Kay held her accountable, pointing out that Susan indeed said that to Sharon Tate, and would have even later attested to tasting Sharon's blood. Thankfully, Susan Atkins was denied parole every time and passed away in prison from brain cancer. Tex Watson's parents were Clarence Denton Watson and Mary Elizabeth Montgomery Watson. Clarence was born on October 3, 1912, and passed away on September 5, 1993. Mary was born on October 2, 1912, and passed on December 8, 2002. Both are buried at Thompson Cemetery in Lavin, Texas, an area close to where Tex grew up in the Farmersville, Copeville area. Though we can't fully confirm or deny this, legend has it that Tex's parents were so ashamed of their son's crimes that they had their headstones turned upside down so that their names wouldn't be recognized, even in death. On top of that, there were rose bushes planted to help obscure the graves. This is something that I had seen talked about on George Stimson's channel, the author of Goodbye Helter Skelter, and also on the MansonBlog.com. Which is one of my favorite sites, really. Anyway, when I mentioned this on my channel in the past, I don't even remember originally when, there was pushback on this, saying it wasn't real. So, in April of 2023, I decided to investigate this legend myself. I had just so happened to be going to the Dallas area of Texas anyway, to see a metal show. When I arrived at Thompson Cemetery, it was actually pretty hard trying to find the graves for Tex's parents. After much walking around, their final resting place was ironically in plain sight, just obscured from view. Despite Tex's parents being near the front of the cemetery, there was something blocking their headstones. Two rose bushes. Over Clarence's grave was a full-grown rose bush, complete with pink roses in full bloom. Oddly, the bush over his mother's grave, Mary, was cut to a very small stem, practically removed. So, the legend of there being rose bushes over the Watson grave was true, mostly. Of course, we can't confirm or deny why they were put there, but they were there. The headstones were also placed upside down, it seemed, that or at the foot of how they were buried. It's hard to gauge which part the head is actually pointing because of this obfuscation. When you'd walk past the graves with the roses right above them, you wouldn't have been able to read the names easily at a glance. In retrospect, this is likely why I missed them when I first walked past. Because Mary's roses were cut, it was easier to read her name, but Clarence's was much harder because the roses were in full bloom over his name. As of December 2025, I'm unsure if the roses are still growing over Clarence's grave or if Mary's ever grew back. Before joining the Manson family, Susan Atkins worked as a dancer at various bars using the alias Sharon King. In her book, Child of Satan, Child of God, she stated that she continuously hoped to be discovered by a talent agent. One day, a guest walked in with her boss, a man who was dressed entirely in black. The man turned out to be Anton LaVey, who was producing a witches' Sabbath, and just so happened to be the high priest of the Church of Satan. Susan's boss asked her to dance one more number for LaVey, to which she did. Afterwards, LaVey stated that she would be very good for the vampire role. Susan expressed curiosity about the vampire role, and LaVey told her, "I'm going to produce and direct for your Mr. Garnet a genuine witch's Sabbath, topless and all. And I think it would be fun for you if you're interested." Susan asked what a witch's Sabbath was, and LaVey replied, "It's a time, my dear, when the witches worship their leader, Satan. It's a marvelous ceremony and will be very colorful for your club. It's a bit out of the ordinary." Susan agreed to it, hoping that it would launch her career. A couple of days later, her boss, Mr. Garnett, told her that the selected group for the performance were to go to the LaVey household and be filled in on the witches' Sabbath and black magic. When she asked why, Mr. Garnett said, "It's all part of a Satan worship routine. Everyone has his own hustle going. LaVey's is this Satan thing. He calls himself the high priest of Satan. He's a full-fledged honcho in that stuff. His wife is a full-fledged witch. They have a Satan church in their home. It's a big thing around here." Susan asked if they really worshipped Satan and if it wasn't for show. Garnett told her, "Hell no. They really mean business. Of course, they put on a pretty good show, too. It's good show business. And that's what I need right now. Something to get us in front of the other clubs. We could be the hottest thing on the strip." Susan agreed to go to the LaVey house, telling him, "All right, Mr. Garnett, but only because I need the job. And I don't go for this Satan stuff." To which Garnett replied, "Neither do I, but business is business." When Susan and the others arrived at the Black House, as LaVey's house was called, she recalled that it was entirely black, including the curtains. Garnett noticed that the lawn was nothing but weeds and dirt, and Susan wrote in her book that nothing of any beauty seemed to be growing around the 2-story black monster. One of the other dancer girls commented on how it was a place for Halloween. Surprisingly, Susan wrote in her book that she was nervous about going into the LaVey household, quote, "actually shaking." Anton was the one to answer the door, and Susan wrote that he was all in black, his powdery white skin glowing. She went on to say, "I felt sick at my stomach as I walked past him. His smile was sickly, I thought. Then I froze in my steps. Straight ahead at the far end of the entrance hall was a human skeleton in a glass case. It seemed to have the same sickly smile as LaVey. This is all the horror movies rolled into one. What am I doing here? I wonder if I'll get out of here in one piece." "Please, come right into the living room," LaVey said with refined politeness. His manners were exaggeratedly excellent. Susan went on to say how LaVey's house scared her and had taxidermied animals which she felt were all looking at her. LaVey and Garnett started talking about the witches' Sabbath, which was to be partially based on the maypole ritual. At this point, Anton's wife showed at the top of the stairs, who, for some reason, Susan recalled in her book as having black hair. By this time, Anton's wife or partner would have been Diane, who was a blonde. Diane invited the girls into the kitchen with her, and Garnett encouraged the girls to go. Susan claimed that she was scared and apparently stated, "I'm afraid I won't be able to stay, Mr. LaVey. I hope you won't be offended, but I don't believe in the devil, and—" Anton interrupted her with a wave of the hand and a smile across his face, stating, "But, Sharon, we don't believe in God either, but that doesn't mean he isn't real." The girls went into the kitchen, and Susan recalled seeing a lion in the yard, who was surely Anton's companion, Tagar. Susan wrote, "He was huge and rather mangy looking, but he gave a loud roar as he saw us enter the room." "That's too much," I said, only barely audibly. "What kind of place is this?" I added under my breath. I backed out of the kitchen and retreated to the living room. "Mr. LaVey," I interrupted. I'd like for you to excuse me, please. I'm not feeling too well. I turned to Garnet. Mr. Garnet, I think I'd better leave now. I'll be your vampire and witch, but I must be going now. Sharon. LeVay's voice was gentle, but his smile was still strange. You've only just arrived. Won't you please stay? I'm holding services this evening. There will be special secret rites, and I'm sure you would enjoy it. It isn't often that I invite an outside guest to these rites. No, thank you, Mr. LeVay. I hope you won't be offended, but I was raised to worship God, not the devil. I must leave now. Garnet then realized what was going on and told Susan to take the car and that the rest of the group would take a cab back. Before leaving, she told Garnet, I'm sorry, Mr. Garnet, but my imagination must have been working overtime. I have visions of somehow being sacrificed and all that. Besides, I'm tired and need to go to bed early tonight. Susan then wrote that she looked back at the scary black house, unsure if she'd be able to go through with LeVay's plans. But then again, what other course did I have? As she wrote. Susan's book then fast-forwards to the performance itself, where she admitted to dropping acid and not wanting to get out of the casket even 5 minutes after curtain call. She stated that she remembered very little of the show, though remembered the audience being shaken by the reality of her performance after she had risen from the casket and pointed a long, blood-red fingernail at the audience, marking them as her next victims. The boyfriend that Susan had at the time supposedly didn't like the road that she was going down. 4 months after the show, she ended up in the hospital half dead from gonorrhea, having had a complete physical breakdown. Anton LaVey isn't mentioned again beyond this point in the book. Now, from the Church of Satan's perspective, Susan Atkins was recalled as just another Haight Street burnout, perhaps a bit more drug-befuddled than some. In The Secret Life of a Satanist, Anton is quoted as having said, she'd beg off rehearsals, saying she had a fever of 108 degrees. But in the end, she made a fine vampire. The Church of Satan does little more to officially explain the connection between Susan Atkins and the church. Presumably, there is nothing more to say. Interestingly, though, in the book Charles Manson Now, Anton's grandson, Stanton LaVey, asserted that Susan Atkins, Bobby Beausoleil, and Charles Manson all had a bigger role in the founding of the Church of Satan. For whatever reason, Stanton believed that Susan had a larger role as a founding member of the Church of Satan, supposedly participating in the Topless Witches Review around 1966 as a publicity photo model on call for nude photo shoots. Allegedly, between 1966 and 1968, she was featured in at least a dozen different men's magazines, pictured alongside Anton in the ritual chamber of the Black House. Stanton went on to say that Susan Atkins was the church's spokesmodel, and Bobby Beausoleil, Kenneth Anger, Anton LaVey, and Charles Manson were its founders. Keep in mind, though, that the Church of Satan was founded, as according to the church, on Walpurgisnacht, 1966, or April 30th, 1966. Charles Manson was still locked up during this time, and he wasn't released on parole until 1967. So Stanton's timeline doesn't add up. What is interesting, though, is that Anton LaVey noticeably hated hippies. This was noted in The Secret Life of a Satanist, where he coincidentally even performed a hippie ritual on August 8th, 1969, where he bitterly cursed the psychedelic vermin infesting the world. The book stated that he called for a purge to relegate the slaves to the pens in which they belong, catalyzing a new era of satanic awareness. The next day, the participants of the hippie ritual read about the horrors discovered in the Benedict Canyon home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Whether or not Susan Atkins had a larger role or spent more time around the Church of Satan can't seem to be proven. And from what I've seen, I don't recall Susan Atkins ever bringing up Anton LaVey or the Church of Satan in any of her parole transcripts either. At least, not that I was able to search through. Though, knowing what we do know about Susan Atkins, some might say that Anton's hatred for hippies may have been justified.